We're good now. Perfect. I see it now. Awesome. Thank you so much, Caleb. It's good to have you on here, man. How are you doing tonight?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well myself. Can't complain. Better than I deserve, I would say. Now, the reason I actually wanted to talk to you is because there's a lot of things going on right now in the political climate that I've seen you talk about. I've seen it in the news. It's happening all around us. It's very hard to miss. Now, one of the things that I kind of wanted to talk about first was COVID. Now, obviously, it's still going around in the United States. It hasn't gone away by any means. One of the questions that I had was, I've seen your coverage briefly on China regarding the pandemic, and I just want to know first off, China, if I recall correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, they haven't had any new cases in quite a while. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
Right. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask about that was, what makes China different from the United States regarding how they went ahead and handled the pandemic from the very start up until this point? Why is there such a vast difference between the two countries and the number of cases and how we've handled it as opposed to Xi Jinping of China?
Well, I think here in the United States, we have just seen epic mismanagement when it comes to the pandemic. We have had every state doing their own thing. We've had huge differences within the power structure over basic things like whether or not people should wear masks. And really that gets down to the fact that we have a capitalist market economy where there are different interests competing with each other, and profits are in command. There's no central vision driving our society. I think a lot of capitalist societies do have a central vision. It's not necessarily, associated with capitalism. But right now in the United States, we're in the beginning of, I think, a societal crisis where our very identity as Americans is different. There are different narratives around the country. There are different agendas politically, economically, and we're not all on the same page. Whereas in China, despite the fact that it's a huge country, it's 1 in 5 human beings on the planet, despite the fact there are huge regional differences, there are different nationalities, there are different religions, they have one Chinese Communist Party, one 5-year economic plan, and the state controls the means of production, and they were able to effectively mobilize the public in the face of the pandemic, and they did a great job, and they dealt with it. They got it before anybody else, let's remember, right? That
Correct.
Any other country had it, they dealt with it. And when they first locked down, and had their serious lockdowns, our media mocked China. Our media said that China was being dangerously authoritarian and scary. Meanwhile, Trump said that China was doing a great job. Now, at this point, now that China is moving ahead, we're being told by our leaders that somehow COVID is all China's fault. It's all China's conspiracy. The World Health Organization, blah blah blah. The facts aren't there to back that story up. But that's the story they're going with. Biden seems to agree with that story to some degree. Trump really emphasizes that story. But the facts just aren't there. I'm seeing China producing protective equipment and sending it around the world. I'm seeing China pushing a vaccine. I'm seeing China set up the health Silk Road to help countries that have been hit pretty hard. Meanwhile, I see us crashing and burning here in the United States, and I see criminal sanctions being in countries to make it more difficult for them to deal with it. Iran had to deal with COVID under U.S. sanctions, and that was just horrendous. But I see not just China, but also Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, many of the socialist countries of the world, Vietnam.
Yeah,
the communist-led region of India, Kerala, right? Many parts of the world that are led by communist parties that have a central plan, that have governments that are based in communities and popular assemblies. They have the ability to mobilize the public more effectively and deal with crises like this. China's economy is now grinding ahead, and our leaders are now making excuses and trying to say, well, this is all China's fault somehow, trying to change the subject away from the real flaws exposed in our system here in the United States.
Absolutely, and I agree with that, with everything you just said there. One thing that's interesting too, I can kind of see why some in the West and the Western media might say that China was implementing some sort of an authoritarian, regime by keeping hundreds of millions of their citizens from leaving their homes. One of the good things, however, though, regarding that is they were actually able to build hospitals with thousands of beds in a matter of days. Now that's very telling as far as how technologically advanced they are and how prepared they are for this type of situation as opposed to the United States. One of the things that I kind of wanted to touch up on too that you just mentioned was the 5-year economic plan. Could you go into just a little bit more detail about how what kind of an impact that has on the people?
Well, you talked about building these hospitals so rapidly. And those hospitals were not built because a capitalist corporation thought they could make money from it. The market didn't create those hospitals. State central planners created those hospitals. We are constantly hit over the head in the United States with this narrative. I've heard it my whole life. I'm sure you have too. Communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Socialism doesn't work. Everywhere communism or socialism has been implemented, it only made life worse. People say these things without thinking about them, and they don't add up to facts. The first 5-year economic plan was created in the Soviet Union in 1928. Stalin created the 5-year economic plan, and the world media laughed, and they said there's no way any country could ever rapidly industrialize like this. There's no way a country could move ahead so quickly. And so the Soviet leaders said, we're going to implement the 5-year plan in 4 years. And that was the slogan that was painted all over the country. 5-year plan in 4 years. And they did it. And they built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant at the time, the Dnieper Dam in Ukraine. They electrified the country. They built modern housing all across the country. They built new universities across the country. They wiped out illiteracy. And the first 5-year plan blew everyone away because 1 year into it, we had the Great Depression in the United States hit, the Great Crash of 1929. 1 year into the 5-year plan. And so the rest of the capitalist world was crashing and burning, mass unemployment, people starving in the streets. But the Soviet government mobilized the population to just build. And they had huge, tremendous economic achievements. And that was the first 5-year plan. And actually, a lot of unemployed engineers and unemployed scientists and technicians from the United States were hired to go to the Soviet Union. There were big lines of people outside of the Soviet government's like unofficial office in New York City, unemployed electrical engineers, architects, other kind of people were hired to go to the Soviet Union. In fact, the Koch brothers, their father, Fred Koch, he was a chemist who invented a new method of thermal cracking, which is how you transform petroleum into gasoline. And he ended up going to the Soviet Union and working on their oil industry. And that's where the wealth of the Koch brothers largely comes from. So there all kinds of capitalist corporations were hired by the Soviet government to help them get going. And we saw this kind of state central planning implemented in China. We saw it implemented in North Korea. We saw it implemented in Cuba, in Vietnam, and other places. Now, it has real effects. Now, China, they realized pretty quickly that after a while, you hit some walls. After you've fully industrialized, you do hit some walls. There becomes a little bit of stagnation. The Soviet Union dealt with stagnation in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Well, China developed, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which included a market sector. There's a very big market sector in China, but that market sector is controlled by the state. Vietnam has a market sector now. Cuba is moving toward more of a market sector. And that I think a market sector is necessary in building a socialist society once you've reached the level of full industrialization. But that doesn't make it an economy where profits are in command. It's very clear if you look at China's economy. The will of corporations, the will of bankers, the will of the owners of industry to make money is not what's in command. The Chinese Communist Party is in command. There's a huge rate of state ownership. There's government control over the banking sector. And even private companies don't do whatever they feel like doing. They do what the state says that they can do. And when they're left up to their own devices, sure, they're just making profits. But at any time, the government can come and say, you're going to do this. And you'll notice that at the beginning of the pandemic here in the United States, Trump invoked, there was a law, I believe it was the Defense Production Act, but he didn't even very much invoke that very strongly, right? He invoked that in a very kind of a mild way. And there was all this outcry, oh my God, the government's taking over the economy. We are addicted to free markets over here, right? We respect the rights of capitalists and the rights of corporations to make profits at the expense of our general public to be healthy, to not get sick, to drink clean water, to have employment, right? We put the needs of corporations and their desire for more and more profits ahead of the needs of the people for a decent life, and that's a big mistake.
Absolutely, and that was a great explanation. And one of the other things to kind of follow up with what you just said there at the very end regarding how we put the needs of we put corporate interests above the interest of the American people. As I'm sure you've seen recently with the second stimulus check. There's been a back and forth between both Democrats and Republicans regarding essentially who's at fault for not helping the American people. And I remember now, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've seen, it seems like it seems like they're both in the wrong. The Democrats, have been talking about these things for months. They both have. One of the things that's fascinating to me, though, is that Trump specifically said a couple days ago regarding the stimulus check that basically he told Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans, hold off on any sort of talks of stimulus until after the election is over. If I win, in the meantime, let's go ahead and focus on getting Amy Coney Barrett in the Supreme Court. Now, what are your thoughts on that? Who's really to blame, if there really is one person or particular party to blame, and what do you think the best course of action would be for both Congress and the president to take at this time?
Well, I mean, if I were the president of the United States, I had support in Congress, we would have dealt with this from the beginning. I mean, we would have had swift government action. We'd have been building hospitals just like China did very rapidly. There would be a huge mobilization of the population. There would be immediately money going to people that are unemployed, money going to the population. There'd be universal basic income implemented immediately. There would be immediate nationalization of major industries and government control over the healthcare sector to deal with this. You deal with a crisis like this with all of society coming together and having a central vision and leadership and addressing the needs of the people. You cannot deal with a crisis like this by allowing the market to just work its magic, right? Free market.
Libertarian thinking.
Yeah, I mean, libertarian thinking just doesn't work in a crisis like this. I mean, that's really all I can say about it. I mean, the Republicans seem more committed to free market ideals than the Democrats are. The Democrats seem to want a more managerial approach, and I think that's because the Democrats are more serving kind of the richest of the rich and the ultra rich. And there's been a big divide in U.S. politics for a long time between the rich and the ultra rich. And the lower levels of capital favor a more libertarian approach, whereas the higher levels of capital favor a more controlled approach. But they all basically have the same goal, which is to maximize their profits, to reduce the living standards of the population. That's what they want. It's just a question of, do they involve the government in doing it, and how do they relate internationally, et cetera. There are differences among our ruling class, but they all want to maximize their own profits.
Absolutely. No, 100%. It seems like, both are at fault. They both have different interests, and it's essentially they're cut from the same cloth, With that being said, though, something that you mentioned too, that I actually wanted to get into eventually, but since you mentioned it just now, was libertarian thinking and libertarianism as a whole, as a concept, and how it's been, how it hasn't been helpful. It's never really worked anywhere, and I've said this before too, sort of in a joking manner, but there was some truth to it when I said it. The main reason is because there's one person in particular that I know that I've been friends with since middle school, who is a staunch libertarian, swears by it, thinks that libertarianism is the future, huge Joe Jorgensen fan, constantly talks about how libertarianism is the cool way to go. It's forget the two-party system, libertarianism all the way. And he's one of those taxation is theft kind of guy. There should be 0% taxation, and I've gotten into a couple back and forths with him. I'm sure he's probably going to see this at some point. But one of the things that, and I'll ask you this in a moment, but one of the things that I always say is that libertarianism sounds good on paper when you see. More specifically on social issues, they're pretty good on that. They want people to just be able to do what they want. That all sounds great. But when we actually get to the economics, when we get to the helping the working class, they really don't really differ from your mainstream conservatives. And libertarians get pretty upset when I say that. And I say the Libertarian Party could be amazing if they stopped focusing so much on this idea that taxation is a form of theft. Realizing where their actual, roots lie. So my memory's kind of fading me currently, but if I recall correctly, libertarianism originally was the term derived back in the 1800s. I believe it was 1857. And the original libertarians were actually communists, socialists, anarchists, etc. And it seems like a lot of people don't realize that. There's a lot of libertarians, like I said, that sort of fall in line with the conservatives of today, and it's pretty hard to distinguish between the two. And whenever you talk about things like Medicare for all, higher taxes on the wealthy, stuff like that, they instantly resort to this idea that, oh, well, you just want bigger government. No, we want small government. They really conflate. They forget where their roots lie, and they conflate so much. And one of the things about it is, like I say, we need to ditch this idea that all taxation is a form of theft. It's a classic Republican talking point. They don't really seem to care much about the lower class, more so for social freedoms. And in one particular exchange that I had with my friend, he was basically saying that he believes that the government should be in charge of as little as possible, and that private companies can actually do anything the government can do but better, which was laughable to me. And I kind of explained to him. I said, well, think of things like the FDA, public housing, public transportation, the CIA, the IRS, Social Security, social programs that are meant to theoretically help better our system. So to say that government doesn't help or do any good is a lie. It's a myth. And like I said, they need to stop pretending like the taxes that help fund those things aren't helping with those things that benefit the American people. So my question for you is, what would you say to a libertarian that uses that talking point that private companies can do things better than the government can? Sounds like more of an anarcho-capitalist position. What would you say to that in response? And what would you say to somebody that conflates higher taxes to help fund social programs and social safety nets for the American people with full-blown socialism?
Okay, well, there's a lot to talk about there in your question, but I want to come at it from a number of different angles. First of all, the economics that libertarians advocate, there's nothing new about it. There's nothing original about it. These ideas go back to Adam Smith, and they go back to the British Empire. And Adam Smith didn't really think of them. They were being put in practice by the City of London. But Adam Smith wrote his Wealth of Nations, as he was in Glasgow, trying to get ahead, trying to keep up. Scotland was a little bit behind Britain. And so Adam Smith wrote this book, The Wealth of Nations, trying to explain all these concepts like the invisible hand and such, that were basically this idea that the market always creates the best outcome, right? And that the government should keep its hands off, and the market will allow, essentially what later the term was coined by advocates of what you call social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, right? All of this is the ideology of the British Empire. We in the United States, our country began by fighting against this. At the time of the American Revolution, we wanted to protect American corporations. We wanted to develop the U.S. economy. And the British Empire was telling us, oh, no, you can't do that. You just have to have a free trade system, government hands off, so that the East India Company and the British companies can just come in and just destroy you economically. And the founding fathers of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, they said, well, we want to have a vibrant economy here in the United States. Now, that meant killing lots of Native Americans, et cetera. It did mean that they wanted an economy for the United States. They didn't want the United States to just be a client of Britain. And so we had a war over it. Well, China fought a war about 100 years later, and it was called the Opium War. And they fought another one. There were 2 Opium Wars. Same thing. The British, were telling the Chinese, oh, no, you have to allow the free trade system. You have to allow total free markets. So our companies can come in there and just put all the Chinese companies out of business, and you become an impoverished client state for Britain. China lost those wars. And as a result, hundreds of millions of people died, and there were famines all the time as a result of British policies in China. And in India, hundreds of millions of people, tens of millions of people died in India, right? In Africa, all over Africa, this happened. All over the world. Ireland was a country that, the Whig Party imposed its horrendous, libertarian policies on Ireland and created a man-made famine. In fact, the reason there are so many Irish people in the United States is because they were driven off the land, right? Their crops failed, they were driven off the land, and they fled to the United States, right? That's why there are so many Irish Americans. And so in the 1800s, everybody knew that libertarian economics did not work. That's why you had the rise of socialism. That's why you had the rise of Marxism all around the world. You had the rise of the labor movement. Everybody knew this didn't work, right? And especially going into the 20th century, the rise of both communism on the left and fascism on the right were in response to the failure of these kind of economic ideas. There was a small group of true believers that you can call the Austrian school, Ludwig von Mises and other kind of people. And they had something called, I think it was called the Montpellier Society, which was like a secret society. And what's interesting about these libertarians that were kind of holding the faith, as the whole world was turning against free market economics, this kind of secret society, Austrian school, Montpellier Society, Friedrich von Hayek, others. What's amusing about them is that they actually supported Hitler and they actually supported Mussolini on the grounds that, hey, at least they're killing communists because communists are the main free market, right? Yep. And libertarians don't want to talk about that. They always say, oh, Hitler was a socialist, blah, 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 blah. Well, at the
it's very similar. Not to cut you off. I apologize. Very similar to what we're seeing as well now with modern libertarianism regarding this sort of hatred and despise of socialists, quote unquote commies, as you mentioned. Very, very similar. And it seems like they're not too far off from their roots as they might think.
Right, indeed. And so, we had the Second World War, and it was, after the Second World War, it was really the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller family, that is old money, that's Standard Oil, that started funding a lot of think tanks that started pushing libertarianism. And it was the Chicago School of Economics, where Milton Friedman comes out of. That's where you get the term neoliberalism.
Yep.
That's where Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was very much promoted by the Freedom Foundation, which is and it was that kind of what they call the Eastern establishment of U.S. politics. That wing of things started trying to kind of develop libertarianism. Now, Ayn Rand became a celebrity because she was a friendly witness to the House Un-American Activities Committee. She worked in a screenwriting office, and she got up and accused all of her screenwriters that she worked with of being communists. And from there, she kind of she got her books selling more, and she started a little bit of a cult. And then Alan Greenspan, who basically was probably the most important figure in the U.S. economy for decades as the head of the Federal Reserve, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Alan Greenspan was a libertarian. He was Ayn Rand's personal protege. He went to jazz clubs with her all the time. I mean, they lived in the same apartment building as Ayn Rand. They were very, very powerful. So libertarianism, reasserted itself in the 1970s after the collapse of the Bretton Woods economic system. That was the economic system that came out of the Second World War. After the collapse of that, and the Nixon shocks, you saw the rise of libertarianism. Libertarianism started being really, really aggressively pushed. They had mini series on PBS, government television, promoting to choose Milton Friedman, and just every you started getting neoliberal free market economics shoved down your throat. And of course, the fall of the Soviet Union was seen as further proof that libertarianism is the only solution. And then, in the 1990s, we saw libertarianism imposed on the former Soviet Union, and it was a disaster. I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union. Economically, when Jeffrey Sachs went into the former USSR and started implementing shock therapy, free market economic policies, it resulted in the death of millions of people. In terms of the skyrocketing drug addiction, skyrocketing crime, skyrocketing unemployment. During that time period, Russia lost roughly 10% of its population. That was either just leaving the country or dying. And that people talk about in the early 90s in Russia. Outside of every major subway stop in the city, you'd see crowds of desperately old people who had no pension and were desperate and were trying to sell you things like old newspapers. They could get a piece of just a little bit of money so they could go eat. I mean, it was that bad. What was implemented, it was so bad. And then Putin, rescued Russia from that disaster by putting oil and gas under government control and restructuring the economy of Russia to be centered around the government once again. Right? In Latin America, in Bolivia, right? They went as far as privatizing the water. So if you collected rainwater on your roof, you were stealing the private property of Nestle or Coca-Cola or these I mean, it was so insane, the free market policies in Ecuador, in Venezuela, where they almost, I mean, they made the price of public transportation go up so high, and the government utilities, electricity wasn't functioning, and all of that. And it was the rise of Bolivarian socialism was kind of a response to the crisis of free market policies in Latin America. So everywhere we've seen these policies implemented, it's been a disaster. It's just been an absolute disaster. Sometimes you'll hear libertarians talk about what they call the Chilean miracle. Well, look into the facts, right? In 1973, the socialist president Salvador Allende was removed by the military. Pinochet became the dictator of Chile. And they brought Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics into Chile. And it was an economic disaster. Everyone admits it was an economic disaster. The Chilean economic miracle did not happen until the 1980s. And that was when they had kicked the Chicago School out. The Pinochet government started renationalizing things and reasserting government control desperately because they were afraid they would have some kind of mass revolt on their hands. So it just doesn't add up, right? I mean, Chilean economics, that was like, they call it the laboratory where the free market experiment was conducted, was a nightmare. Mass child malnutrition, mass unemployment, the average family spending like 70% of their income on food alone. I mean, Chile under the Pinochet regime, when it was implementing free market policies, was a disaster. I mean, this is just basic stuff. I mean, you can read Naomi Klein, very widely circulated book called The Shock Doctrine. You can read Philip Thayer's very good book called Europe Since 1909, which goes over the results of this. I mean, there's so much written about neoliberalism and its economic failures, but yet libertarianism, there's just so much money that has been pumped into putting out these lies. That I mean, I debated Stefan Molyneux. I just laid out.
I rewatched some of that today because I saw you shared that, and I was rewatching it. I got a good laugh out of some of the arguments that he made. I love that debate. Go on.
Yeah. I mean, it's just there's a lot of money that has been pumped into just keeping this mythology alive. But basic economic data shows that libertarianism is a disaster. It was a disaster when the British did it in the 1800s. It's been a disaster when the United States implemented it in Latin America and all of that. And on top of that, we've been having it here in the United States. I mean, we have, compare our educational system, for example, to any other Western country. We have the lowest test scores, right? But since the 1980s, we've been pushing libertarianism in our educational system, school choice, charter schools, schools for profit. And the result has been the quality of American education getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, if more free markets was the answer, we are the most free market country in the Western world, and we have the lowest standard of living in the Western world.
Yes, we do.
We don't have health care for our population. We don't provide university education for our population. At this point, we don't build roads. I mean, in a number of states, the government is actively unpaving the roads because the government doesn't have enough tax revenue to maintain paved roads, right? Our water is not being properly purified, and so that when libertarians sit there and it's like, oh, the government is everywhere, it's out of control. No, it's not. Our government is rolling over and playing dead while corporations, make profits left and right, and average Americans are being left behind. I don't think the answer is to get the government off our backs. I think what we need is a government of action, a government that actually fights for average Americans and stands up against these corporations. The problem is that are just corporate shills. They just do whatever these corporations want. And right now, these corporations want a weak government. They want a pathetic government that'll just roll over and play dead. And I think that as much as I don't like Trump, because he gave an aura of strength, he does that, right? He gives off an aura of strength. He sounded like he was tough. He said he was going to rebuild infrastructure and all of that. That scared some of the elite in the United States because the last thing they want is another Roosevelt or another Lincoln, right? Somebody that would stand up to corporations and would fight for average Americans, would work with organized labor, would work with Marxists and socialists. They're afraid of an American Hugo Chavez emerging crisis because right now that's what the United States desperately needs, and everyone can see that. We need a government of action to fight for working families.
And the saddest part is, and it's funny because Trump ended up becoming a corporate socialist in a way. And the saddest part is, when you say stuff like that, I want a government of action. I want when libertarians complain about how the government's all over the place. They're the ones that are ruining everything. When you present that idea that no, not quite. I actually think that the government should be there for the American people. It should be there to help out. We should be creating more social safety nets. That's when essentially the conversation ends right there for libertarians, because they conflate that with, oh, you're a communist. Oh, you're a communist. You want to take my money. You're a thief. And it's like, how can you reason with that type of that ideology? And on top of that, you mentioned that as well in the 80s. Before that, I believe it was actually Ronald Reagan in his famous speech or an interview he did, where he talked about how if fascism comes to the United States, it'll come in the form of liberalism. He had said prior to that he believes that the very heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. And as you said, that's kind of where it shifted, And I feel like there's a lot of people who maybe once were the Reagan conservatives who are alive today, who have transitioned over to libertarianism because they don't really like the way conservatism has gone nowadays. So they're like I said earlier, cut from the same cloth essentially, and that's very interesting. And you outlined that perfectly. How libertarian went from, how it went from socialist ideals to what we now consider shills for capitalism. It's pretty wild, to say the least. Very good analysis there, Caleb. One of the things also that I kind of wanted to touch up on as well was regarding the Democrats and the election, of course. I had mentioned to you that I wanted to talk about the upcoming election. We're, 30 days away, 31 days or so. So we're creeping up there very quickly. It's going to be here sooner than we know it. There's a lot of talk going on right now about voter suppression and voter fraud and mail-in ballots and things of that nature. One of the things that seems to be, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, maybe you are, but, we always talk about the Republicans, how they're actively engaging in voter suppression, gerrymandering, other things, how they're trying to pour millions of dollars to try to, quote unquote, patrol polling places to make sure that there's no, suspicious activity going on. And we've seen the president himself say, if you see any suspicious activity, do something about it. And it's quite scary, to say the least. Now, and while I know for sure Republicans are actively engaging in that, the Democrats aren't much better regarding voter suppression. And here's what I'm referring to. This is regarding this election in particular. Now, there's a lot of people that are voting for the Green Party if they're on the ballot. Howie Hawkins, and I believe it's Angela Walker's the vice presidential pick. Excuse me. Now, I don't know if you've seen this recently, but the Democrats are actively trying to get the Green Party essentially destroyed. So the Democrats, of course, Hillary Clinton losing to Donald Trump in 2016, furious about that. Jill Stein at the time was the candidate, and she took a lot of votes that, had she not been there, would have most likely gone to the Democrats. And one of the things that's happening right now is, if I recall correctly, in Montana, the Democrats have actually successfully been able to get 5 Green Party candidates kicked off of the ballots. Now, Montana isn't quite as important for the presidential election because for the last 10 elections or so, they've voted pretty consistently Republican, except for Bill Clinton in 1992, 1993. But they vote pretty reliably Republican. And they also went ahead and, but to follow up with that, while they may not be so concerned about the presidential election, they certainly want to go ahead and try to win the Senate. So they're actively trying to go ahead and remove those Green Party candidates. And in that same state, Montana, the Democrats actually contacted people who had signed, voters who had signed the petition for the Green Party in Montana to be on the ballot, essentially bullying them into revoking their signatures. And it's pretty heavy stuff right now. There's lawsuits in different states. I believe in Texas, the Democrats are suing to get the Green Party off the ballot. So I just kind of want to know, because there's a lot of people out there that don't like Biden. And you know that. You're one of them. You don't really like Biden that much. He doesn't really have too much to offer, to say the least. There's not really much going for him. Now, with that being said, do you think the Democrats are being hypocrites by actively trying to remove the Green Party, knowing that the Green Party is going to get a fair amount of votes? And what's your take on this?
Well, I think it's a little bit more than electoral. I think that the Democrats are doing this for more than just concern about elections. Because the notion that the Democrats own all the votes that are not Trump votes, right? And that if you're going to vote for the Green Party, you should be voting for the Democrats. They're going to make sure you can't do it at the ballot, et cetera. That's a widespread feeling. But I also think that what people need to understand is that if you vote for Joe Biden, you're not voting just against Donald Trump. You are voting for pulling the door shut to make sure that nothing like Trump and nothing like Bernie Sanders can ever happen again. Because that is what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are openly saying that they will do. They are demanding tech censorship to suppress voices like yours and mine. They are demanding a crackdown on alternative media. And they want to get in there and make sure that nothing like Donald Trump and nothing like Bernie Sanders can ever happen again. They want centrist rule in the Democratic Party. They want neocon rule in the Republican Party. And they don't like the fact that there is an upsurge going on. If you're voting for Donald Trump, you're voting for 4 more years of instability, chaos, racial unrest. Bad thing that's happening now. I would never support that. But voting for Biden, you're voting for the richest of the rich coming in there and nailing the door shut in a very authoritarian way to make sure that people in this country on the right and the left who are upset with the status quo are silenced and are pushed out of American politics. And so that's your choice. It's not much of a choice. I won't be voting for either of the major candidates, I mean, I don't like Trump. Trump sickens me. But at the same time, so does Biden and so does Kamala Harris. I actually wrote a book about Kamala Harris.
Yes, I still need to check that out.
Yeah. And, I mean, we are entering a dangerous time. And that really, I mean, the reason Trump got elected is because the Democrats rigged it against Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders would have won the elections. And if Bernie Sanders were the nominee right now, he would have this, a shoe-in. He'd be winning.
Oh, yeah.
But imagine Bernie Sanders debating Trump rather than
really, really quickly, because I just thought about that as well. I actually thought about that right after the debate a few weeks ago in September. I thought to myself, because obviously we saw Trump's performance. Biden was nothing special, of course, but Trump was constantly interrupting, just trying his hardest to overwhelm Joe Biden. And one could make the argument that he did it purposefully to try to throw Joe Biden off of his game, because we, all the stuff about him, having dementia, his memory, etc. So, I could see it being an effective tactic. But my question was, I had originally thought, yes, Bernie Sanders, if he had been the one on that debate stage, he would have decimated Trump. But then I also thought to myself, with how overwhelming Trump was trying to be towards Biden, do you think that Bernie Sanders, as diplomatic as he is, would have done a better job?
Yeah. Oh, I think he definitely would have. I think Bernie Sanders has an activist background, and he's dealt with hecklers and disruptors his whole career. I do think that a lot of what we saw from Trump on the debate stage, at least for the first half hour or so, that almost was, I mean, Trump kind of looked like a deer in the headlights, as they say. He was a little bit startled, and he was interrupting from a place of kind of desperation and fear. After a while, he got his energy back, and he just sounded like he was interrupting as Donald Trump. But the first 30 minutes, he looked not so well. Now, I guess we found out he had COVID, so maybe he didn't have the strength he thought he had. And Biden found his energy too later on in the debate. But I see what you're saying, and it says a lot that Bernie Sanders is very old, Joe Biden's very old, Donald Trump is very old. Whoever wins this next election will be the oldest president in all of U.S. history.
Yep.
It's kind of disappointing, but that's kind of how our political system has been. It kind of reminds you of the fall of the Soviet Union. At the time of the Soviet fall, it was like people used to joke that like a Soviet premier is dying every week, right? Because it was, Brezhnev died, and then Andropov, and it was like there was a funeral going on every week, and that our political elites in the United States, that's a sign of entrenched power, very much, when your politics is dominated by very, very old men who've been in the business a long time, right? And it becomes a matter of waiting your turn in this kind of bureaucratic games, not who's the most charismatic, not who represents what the people really, really want.
Correct.
And there's a lot of
Correct.
things in the United States right now that kind of parallel the fall of the Soviet Union in an odd way. As it seems like we've lost our central vision. As a country, there's not really a central vision. There's regional differences that are developing. There are economic problems. I mean, there's some weird parallels between the fall of the Soviet Union and what's happening in the United States right now. And if you know the real economic results of the fall of the Soviet Union, that should be something that's very concerning. Obviously, we don't have a socialist system here, and there's about a million differences. But it's worth pointing out those parallels.
Absolutely. No, it's definitely something historic is happening here before our eyes, and we'll see what happens. Only time will tell. We'll see. I'm very unsure about. Well, I've had this conversation with multiple people, and I get asked a lot. Oh, well, who do you think is going to win? Who do you think is going to win? And I kind of want to ask you the same thing, just based off of what you've seen so far, and with the recent polls of Biden being ahead. I still say I do think Trump is going to stretch it out at this time. There's been a lot of developments over the last few days, though, that could, if I looked at it, if I took the time and actually read through it thoroughly, might sway my thought process. But a question for you is: at this very moment, do you have any sort of idea of who you think might win?
No, my opinion seems to shift every 2 days now. There'll be 2 days.
Yeah.
Pretty sure Trump is going to lose. There'll be then 2 days where I'm pretty sure Trump is going to win. I really don't know. I mean, last election, it seemed absolutely clear Donald Trump was going to lose, and he won. So, that was a shocker to me. But now, things are different, and I really don't know. I really, really don't know. What I really fear is a contested election, because that'll be a disaster for the whole country if we're in that kind of situation. I must say that it'll be best for the country if whoever wins in a landslide, and it's very clear, and it's over the next day. And
is willing to, transition the power, obviously, as well.
Yeah, but if we get into a situation where there's two sides, and that could get ugly very, very, very quickly. And it's funny because as a leftist, there's part of you that wants to go, oh, that could be a revolutionary opening. No, it wouldn't be. I mean, there's no revolution going to happen here. There's no vanguard party. There's no mass socialist organization. There's a lot of chaos in the streets, but chaos in the streets does not make revolution, right? Revolution,
correct.
Destruction, not an act of destruction. And that there is no vanguard party here with millions of people. There is no, this is, the country deteriorating further and having the elite, potentially shooting at each other or something is a disastrous situation that would be a disaster for everyone in the country. And
correct.
That today elections, we know who won. The other side, admits defeat, and we move on.
No, absolutely, and I agree with that. And you something interesting you mentioned there as well about the revolution. I hear that word thrown out a lot, and I think to myself, okay, well, what would be necessary in order for that to happen? We've been talking about it for such a long time. One of the things that I can't recall how you feel about reformism, but one of the things that I say sometimes is, if we can get out there, vote and work within the system to try to better it. I get laughed at sometimes when I say that, maybe it's wishful thinking, but to you personally, when you think of reformism or trying to work within the system to try to better it, do you agree with that, sentiment, or do you believe that, violent revolution is inevitable and necessary?
Well, the way I understand things, right? Because it's, again, there's some nuance to this kind of position, because there are people on the one side that'll say one thing, there's other people on the other side that'll say another thing, and there's actually the actual Marxist position is rather nuanced, right? Which is that Marxism recognizes that we do need a new state, that the capitalist state is designed to serve capitalism, and so you do need a new state. The socialist society requires a new state. It does recognize that socialism is not just, gradually fixing up capitalism until it turns into socialism. There is a clear event horizon where you go from, the leadership of the capitalist class to the leadership of the working class. But at the same time, genuine Marxists have never, advocated a violent revolution, right? That socialists, Marxists, you can go back to Lenin, you can go back to Che Guevara even, that they always advocate a peaceful transition to socialism. And violent revolutions only happen when there is no other choice, when people are basically up against a wall, facing being slaughtered, have no choice, but they have to defend themselves, right? So, when people say, well, just work within the system, usually that just means forget about socialism, right? That just means, just be a regular Democrat. And that's not the Marxist
Toe the
position.
party line.
Yeah,
right.
We should be talking about socialism every day. We should be challenging Democrats from the left. We should be advocating a socialist society, advocating transitional demands, like public ownership of our natural gas, like, a mass mobilization to rebuild the country, public control of banking. We should be advocating a social program constantly, but at the same time, we should never be advocating some kind of violent revolution. Violent revolutions only happen because the capitalist class chooses it, and they choose it by basically eliminating people's democratic rights, giving people no alternative but to take up arms to defend themselves. I would think of like Abraham Lincoln, for example, right? Abraham Lincoln wanted to rule the United States as the president. He wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. The slaveholders wouldn't have it, so they took up arms violently against democracy. So Lincoln had no choice but to carry out a violent revolution to overturn slavery in the South, right?
Correct.
Was a very similar situation. They wanted to peacefully work with the British to gradually, allow more economic independence. The British wouldn't allow it. They conducted the Boston Massacre. They did other, crimes, and so the colonists had no choice but to take up arms, right? They were being killed, they were being slaughtered, and so they had to take up arms, right? And that if you look throughout Marxism, it's the same story, right? The Russian Revolution happened. It happened mainly because there was a widespread revolution to bring down the Tsar in February, right? In February of 1917. The Tsar was brought down. He was losing the war. He was embarrassing the country. But so after the Tsar was brought down, there was a fight among the Russian capitalists. Do we stay in World War I or do we pull out of the war? And the capitalists that were tied in with American companies and French companies and British companies wanted to stay in World War I. And the capitalists that were tied in with German companies and were, more tied in with just the Russian domestic economy, they wanted to pull out. The Bolsheviks had this huge organization they had built, and they were known as the anti-war guys. They were against World War I consistently, right? And so they had this network of community assemblies called Soviets that they had built. And so, the provisional government had come into being. There was a constituent assembly. But this, the section of the Russian ruling class that wanted to continue fighting in World War I decided they were going to overthrow democracy. And there was a general called Kornilov, who was this right-wing general who was trying to set up a fascist dictatorship. And he, was marching towards St. Petersburg with his army to, make Russia into a fascist state and to just exterminate the anti-war elements and set up a military dictatorship. And the Bolsheviks started organizing the people in St. Petersburg and in other cities to, arm themselves and defend themselves from what was called the Kornilov reaction. And it got to the point that their militias, their self-defense community militias, were actually bigger than the regular government's militias. And the regular government started opening up the armories and giving guns to the Bolsheviks. And their army got to be so big and their city was so well fortified that General Kornilov turned around and he didn't march into St. Petersburg, and he surrendered. The Kornilov reaction was defeated. And after that, the Bolsheviks, because they had a bigger army and their community assemblies were bigger, they declared the Soviets to be the Soviet government, right? That's the Russian Revolution. It was an act of self-defense against violent reaction, right? The Chinese Revolution is the same story, right? That the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists, they teamed up to fight against Japan, and to defeat the Japanese invaders in World War II. After the war, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek wanted to have a united government. It would have communists and nationalists in it, right? But then Chiang Kai-shek declared that communists were not allowed to participate in the government. And Mao and the Chinese communists said, well, no, we're allowed to participate. We, fought against Japan. We did all this. We're allowed to participate. And Chiang Kai-shek, not only did he not allow the communists to participate, he was demanding that the communists in the areas that they controlled, that they had liberated from Japan, give up their weapons, give up their guns, and basically be slaughtered by the nationalists. And the communists were saying, no, we're not going to let you slaughter us. We're not going to let you come into the areas where we've redistributed land and armed the peasantry and started teaching people to read. We're not going to let the nationalists just come in and force us out of power. So they were forced to take up arms once again to defend themselves from Chiang Kai-shek wanting to wipe them out after the Second World War, and they took power. And they took power in response to Chiang Kai-shek locking them out of the democratic process. Mao wanted a coalition government between communists and nationalists, right? I mean, communists participate in elections all over the world. I've been to international communist gatherings. I've met communists that are in parliament, communists that are, all over the world. Communists get elected. They implement programs peacefully. Venezuela, they were elected, right? A socialist government coalition was elected. It was the Communist Party, the Bolivarians and others. And then there was a violent coup by the capitalists. That coup was
correct.
And after that, they had a new constitution that was imposed. And they created the colectivos and communes. And they even have the Bolivarian militias. And they changed the way the army works. And the army is trained in Cuba now instead of being, just trained in Venezuela. And they had to change the state. And they had to implement new governments and new guidelines for the police force, right? The state has to change. If you're, and that's the mistake that a lot of the social democrats and reformists have made, is they don't change the state, right? So Lenin, when he says that you have to have a new state, he's right? And when he says that there will most likely be a violent revolution because the capitalists are going to use the state to violently suppress peaceful organizing, he's right. But that's different than saying that communists should advocate a violent revolution. Advocating a violent revolution is ultra-leftism. It is not correct, right? And if you do that, working class people have violence in their communities. They have violence in their everyday lives. It's working class people that are sent off to fight in the wars of the capitalists. So if you go around advocating violence, that's not what the working class wants. The working class does not want socialism because it'll bring more chaos. The working class wants socialism that will bring order. And that's constantly what the communists are doing. They're putting forward a program to bring order to society. How can we make your life more stable, more peaceful, and more prosperous? That's what our communist program is about. That's what it's about. I've often said that I'm not a communist because I want to destroy America. I'm a communist because I want to save America, right? And I want to save America from the greed and the irrationality of capitalism that's leading to chaos all over our society right now. This isn't communists that are creating mass unemployment right now. It's not communists that are creating mass instability across the United States right now. It's not communists that are unpaving the roads. It's not communists with the COVID crisis. Capitalism is creating chaos and instability. Communism is about bringing order by putting rational economic control and human reason and science in control of the economy, not the irrationality of the profits system.
Correct. Beautifully said. Wow. Yeah, that was a great answer. Yeah, no, that hits the nail on the head right there, man. And this whole thing, we'll see how it unfolds come next month. I'm pretty sure there's going to be more stuff, more violence to come, sadly. But we'll see what happens.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions. What part of the country are you in?
I'm actually in Orlando, Florida.
Okay, and tell me, what's the political atmosphere there like? Are people in your area Trump supporters? Are they supporters of Biden? What's the atmosphere like?
Yeah, no, great question. So interestingly enough, Florida has mostly, so for decades now, Florida has been pretty much Republican. But so I actually the other day drove around for about an hour around the richer part of my community. I live in a city called Winter Park. It's sort of a metropolitan area of Orlando, and pretty good city. It's very wealthy. And I was driving down. There's a college called Rollins College over in Winter Park. It's a private school, very expensive, one of the most expensive in the state. And around that area, there's very big houses. And I was driving around there the other day for about an hour, just kind of going down each road, seeing if I could see any political signs for the election. And believe it or not, Caleb, I actually did see about an even amount of both Biden and Trump signs. So I actually saw one Biden sign. It was a big house, had a Biden sign in the front, and then a big tarp going down their balcony that said Black Lives Matter. And I was like, well, that's ballsy in this area because, like I said, a lot of Trump signs. Haven't seen anything like that.
Is there a big influence by the Miami Cuban lobby? Are they really influential there?
So there's actually so Miami is has a lot of Trump supporters. There's a lot of Cubans that fled from Cuba and are very, very much anti-socialist, communism. So they tend to, they enjoy the anti-socialist rhetoric that comes from not only the president but the Republicans as well. They're in lockstep with them in regards to that. Yeah, a lot of Trump supporters, but I would say for the most part it's pretty even. Funnily enough, the current chairman of Proud Boys, I forget his name right now, but I had him added on Facebook several months ago. His nickname on Facebook was Rodrigo. I don't remember his last name though. But he actually lives in Miami, and he actually ran a failed congressional run. He didn't advertise. He didn't really do anything. It just kind of sunk to the ground. But he lives in Miami, if I recall correctly. So yeah, no, Miami is kind of a mixed bag, much like Florida in general. Back in 2018, when it was Andrew Gillum versus Ron DeSantis, I don't know if you recall the results of that midterm here in Florida, but it was neck and neck. Like I believe it was like 50.5% DeSantis versus 49.5% Gillum. It was very, very close. So Florida is pretty split right now. I think Florida is. I would not be surprised if Florida ended up going Biden next month. So, like I said, I see a lot of people talk about how there's no enthusiasm for Biden. I haven't people who tell me that they haven't seen any Biden signs, maybe in their particular area. But I'll tell you, Caleb, I've seen a lot of Biden signs. I've seen a lot. I just saw one yesterday. It was a big truck that was driving in my area, and he had 4 big, tall flags waving. 3 of them were Biden-Harris flags, and then another one was a rainbow LGBT flag, and he was driving around, and I thought that was cool. So there is enthusiasm for Biden. I went to the Dollar Tree a couple days ago as well, and I saw an elderly woman who had a Biden-Harris mask on, and I complimented her. I said, "I like your mask," and she's like, "Oh, thank you. You're the first person to say anything about it." I'm like, "Yeah, it's the first time I've seen a political mask," and she was like, "Oh yeah, the area that I live in." She was telling me how the area that she lived in was predominantly Republican, and how I guess somebody had stolen her Biden lawn signs, which was interesting to me. But it is what it is. But yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely support for Biden here in Florida. Let me tell you, I think it's going to be very even come next month.
Now, let me ask you: are you able to engage with people in the area about socialism ever? I mean, do you have conversations with people?
Not quite. So I used to. This was long before the pandemic was even a thought. This was last year. I used to go around downtown Orlando on the weekends at times. I used to go to certain political events that were going on. I went to a drag queen story hour about over a year ago. I've been to political events. I've interviewed people. I've engaged, but I haven't actually gone out and because I'm a bit inhibited at the moment because of the current situation, and I don't have a big budget or anything. The microphone I'm actually using now is a microphone that I used to interview people on the street from time to time, but it's been kind of difficult lately. But I haven't really gone out for any sort of real activism, more so just to kind of get people's takes on current events and stuff like that. So
okay. Great. Well,
but
I wanted to ask. Yeah.
No, of course, and I don't remember. Is it the Center for Political Innovation, CPI, that you're doing? Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I remember I saw you covering that on stream, and I actually wanted to ask about that as well. How's it going? Is it coming soon?
Saturday, you're going to have a conference online. It'll be on October 17th, this coming Saturday. We're going to have an conference that'll be streaming. So we'll have a couple different speakers. We're going to have some cultural performers. It's going to be really great. I'm very excited. Great.
So, I assume it's free to watch, or do you have to be a patron?
It's free to watch. Free to watch, yeah, and it'll be streaming on my channel. And if you want to get in the chat and ask some questions and all of that, and there'll be different speakers and stuff. And we're just trying to get off the ground. We're hoping that as the pandemic comes to an end, we were actually hoping to have a conference, then we had to call it off because of the pandemic. We're hoping to have a conference after this pandemic is over and get together, because there's so many people. I don't know how many people I've been approached by who say, "Hey, I like your stuff. I watch your channel. You talk about socialism, Caleb," they say to me, in a way that nobody else does. "I want to get involved with what you're doing. You're doing something so special." And there's a real hunger for what I talk about on my YouTube channel right now. And so, it's very frustrating to be in this kind of paralysis where all I can do is kind of get on YouTube and run my mouth.
Correct.
lot of people really want to start building the kind of socialist education and socialist, socialist awareness that I'm trying to build on my channel. And so I think we can build something very, very exciting. I'm looking to build a think tank, not a new party, but a think tank that will, influence and engage with people in many different political groups and such. And I'm hoping we can get something off the ground. So tune in this Saturday, October 17th. You can watch our presentations. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of exciting in the world right now. So, we just got to keep moving ahead. So it was good to talk to you, Joel.
Caleb, it was a pleasure, my friend. We should definitely do this again. And I'll definitely be tuning in on Saturday. I was going to say, and I still want to hold you to that in the future for the debates. If I ever have anybody that's willing to engage, I would love to be a host, moderator, whatever. So we could definitely discuss that. Love your content. Love what you do. Keep up the great work, my friend. And I hope you stay safe.
Sure. And my best wishes to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Caleb. Have a good night, my friend.
Yep.